We're going to go ahead and get started. So good afternoon. I'm Amanda Kinderman, and I'm a member of the Cancer Center Education Work Group. Thank you all for joining the presentation today. As you join the meeting, your audio will be muted. Please remain muted during the presentation. We will have a Q&A session following the presentation, and you will be able to unmute your audio to ask questions. We also encourage you to use the chat feature to pose questions during the presentation. We will try to get to as many of your questions as possible in the Q&A session. In the chat, you will see a link to sign in for the session. Please take a moment to complete the sign-in. This is extremely helpful to us to measure attendance at our virtual session. If you signed in, you'll also receive an emailed anonymous survey following today's presentation. Please complete it as your feedback is extremely helpful to us in planning these events. I have the privilege of introducing today's speaker, Dr. Amy Lopez. Dr. Lopez is a licensed clinical social worker and instructor at the Helen and Arthur E. Johnson Depression Center. Dr. Lopez provides individual, family, couples, group therapy, and telehealth to adults and children experiencing depression, anxiety, mood difficulties, or life stressors. She specializes in treating personality disorders and is trained in dialectical behavior therapy, which uses mindfulness and active problem solving to help clients improve relationships and better understand their emotions. Dr. Lopez has also worked in child protection, residential mental health treatment, the juvenile justice system, as a social work researcher, and as social work faculty. Dr. Lopez's research interests are in the area of social presence and internet-based mental health treatment, specifically how the therapeutic alliance is impacted by the use of technology. Dr. Lopez also studies happiness and is the author of Search for Awesome, 10 Experiments in the Quest for Happiness. Using theories of positive psychology and well-being, she offers workshops to the community to help people learn to build happier lives. I will now turn it over to our presenter to get started.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining me today. As she mentioned, today we're going to be talking a little bit about happiness. And so welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining me. But I think the first question is happiness? We're in a pandemic. How can we possibly talk about happiness in the middle of a pandemic? People are stressed, they're tired, and it's not even just a pandemic, but we also have societal unrest going on. We have a very contentious election happening. Like 2020 is not the place for happiness, right? I mean, that's kind of what you all are thinking is, what are we doing? The reason we're here today is because of hope, is because we actually can't give up on this idea of looking for happiness. 2020 is going to end eventually, and there's got to be something on the other side. And so that's really, what are we going to do to get us through? How are we going to be able to handle all of these stressors and all of these things that are happening until we can get through? And that's where hope comes into play. So what we're going to do today is we're just going to talk a little bit about what happiness is. Hopefully you get a chance to laugh and have fun. Laughter actually builds our immunity, so it's great. And humor is always a great coping mechanism. So I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about happiness, that we can find ways to maybe be a little bit happier, which I know is challenging in the middle of a pandemic, and then just open it up for questions about what is this happiness thing all about. So let's start there. So I'd like, if you could, to take a minute or two for yourself and maybe pop into the chat if you would. What is happiness anyway? How do you define happiness? So why don't you take a minute and think about that, think about your definition of happiness, and maybe again, put it into the chat. So what I typically hear when I do these kind of workshops is, you know, happiness might be contentment, it might be joy. Let me tell you what the literature actually says. So here's what the research says happiness is. So happiness can be defined in three distinct ways. The first way we're going to talk about it is happiness as an emotion. And this is one that people tend to sometimes correlate with joy, but it's different. So I want you to keep in mind that our emotions are biologically based. They're in us for a reason, and typically they exist to motivate us. They exist to get us to do something. So again, if we're afraid, we feel fear, we should run and hide. If we're angry, maybe we fight back. Guilt, whatever we're doing, we should do less of it. Joy, whatever we're doing, we should do more of it. Happiness is actually an interesting spot where you don't have to do anything. It's kind of like you're driving down the road and you know how you may get a light that you need to fill up with gas or that you need to fill your tire. Happiness is that space where you don't have to do anything. It's your emotions saying, you know what, whatever we're doing right now, it's all good. So just keep doing what we're doing. The next one is I want you to think about happiness as an ever-changing state of being. When I do these presentations, the most frequent comment I get is, well, but you can't be happy all the time. And I'm like, I know that's true, but our unhappiness sometimes tells us that it's time to make a change. So if you're in a job that you cry yourself to every day, if you're in a relationship that you can't really tolerate, you're not finding any joy in it, you're in a friendship that's exhausting you, maybe it's time to make a change. And so I think there's some value in listening to our unhappiness because there might be some valuable information in it. And then third is thinking about happiness as an overall satisfaction with our life. And the reason this is important, as I said, is that you can't be happy always. You can't be happy forever. But there are people who say, well, you know, if I can think about that my life is more good than bad, it's had some meaning, it's had some purpose, and I can find some reason why I was here on earth, then that fills my need for happiness. So there is some sense of satisfaction that correlates with happiness. And also happiness is a skill that can be learned. And that's really why I'm here talking to you today, is to say, maybe there are things, even during the pandemic, that we could work on that might make us just feel a little bit different. That being said, I do have some caveats. So the first question I get frequently is, can we even be any happier? If we do this happiness work, will we be any happier? And the answer is maybe. And because there are a couple of things that come into play. So the first one is that genetics actually account for about 50% of our happiness. What that means is that our happiness is actually part of our personality. Just like some people are outgoing, some people are really organized, our happiness is actually part of our genetic makeup. And so it's difficult to say, I want to be as happy as that person over there, would just be like saying, I want to be as tall as that person over there. Because there is a correlation between, again, our genetic makeup and our personality and our level of happiness. Now, this comes into play in a couple of ways. When I did my research, I came across this small group of people that I refer to as naturally happy people, meaning they don't have to do anything to work at their happiness. They just are happy. And I was kind of blown away a little bit. I thought, well, that's unusual. I've never heard of that before. But there are some people out there who, again, it's just part of their genetic makeup to just be kind of happy and content with the world. What I found was those people also had very low level of neuroses, meaning they didn't worry very much. And I think that's an important factor to keep in mind. Similarly, when I was doing my happiness study, I found this other group of people that I like to call the grumpy happy people. And what those are people who like to complain. And that's just the easiest way to say it. Like, I met with some of these people and they came into the happiness studies talking about everything that was wrong. And I kind of said, you know, this is a happiness study, right? And they said, sure. I'm happy. I like my life. I just like to complain about it. So I think we have to kind of keep in mind that we also can't tell what other people may be thinking or feeling because it's part of their personality. Now, I said 50% of our happiness is genetic, which also means that 50% of it is up to us. So it's not like I can't completely change, but there are things I can do to make myself happier. This is also a really important factor, is that age really impacts our level of happiness. And it's kind of a U-shaped curve, meaning that when people are in their early 20s, they tend to be pretty happy. And that's because we're full of excitement and we're excited about the world has to offer. Unfortunately, in kind of our late 20s, early 30s, as the world starts to throw things at us, parenting and career and financial consequences, our happiness tends to dwindle a little bit. The good news is that it rebounds. So for women, it's kind of early 40s. For men, it tends to be late 40s, early 50s that we tend to rebound. And then people tend to be fairly happy from then on out. In fact, more significantly happy than they were even in their 20s. So I like to tell people that if you don't really want to do the happiness work, you can always just wait. Let's talk a little bit about happiness research. And so one question I pose to people frequently is happiness science or pop culture? What would you think, or what would you guess? The answer is it's actually both. And so we have a fair amount of data and a fair amount of research behind happiness and what it actually means, ranging from small informal discussions to large multinational surveys. We can actually even put people into a MRI machine and have them think about happy things and see where their brain lights up. So we actually have a fair amount of data about what makes people happy. Good news is you don't have to look any of that up. I'm going to tell you what that is right now. However, I'm going to first tell you what doesn't impact happiness. And this is important because I think there are a lot of myths about happiness, that people think things will make them happy when in fact they won't. So first is actually job type or title. And this is important to know, that your job, your individual job, impacts your happiness. How you spend all day and how it fits for you definitely influences how happy you are overall, and again, whether or not you might need to make a change in your life. However, there's no real data saying that CEOs are any happier than grocery store clerks, or that people who drive a cab are any happier than people who work in a nursing home. It really is, again, about individual personality and finding something that provides some meaning to you. And kind of this notion of vocation. Am I doing the thing that I feel like does bring me happiness and brings me meaning? It doesn't necessarily have to, but how you spend your days is important. Now, I say that there are some indications that some jobs are a little bit happier than others. And one of those, actually, the happiest, which you may or may not be able to guess, and maybe not true right at this moment in time, are elementary school teachers. And part of that is because their jobs have an endpoint. They have a start and an end to them. They have a fall, and then they have a spring, and then they get to start over. So if they've had the worst class they've ever had, good news is next year they don't have to deal with them. Similarly, they get to see a lot of growth. They get to see kids grow, read, and grow and change. And plus, they get to spend a lot of time with kids who tend to laugh a lot. In fact, the average 6-year-old laughs 600 times a day. For adults, it's down to like 30 maybe, and that's on a good day if we find something funny. So I think it just comes back to thinking about that in general, if your job fits you, then you'll probably be happy. But it doesn't mean that any one job is happier than others. Similar with environment, this is personality driven. So what that means is that people who live in the city are not necessarily any happier than people who live on the beach versus people who live in the mountains versus people who live on a farm. It really is, again, how does that fit your individual personality? Any kind of past history or trauma or life stressors, or even health don't actually impact happiness, that people are resilient, people can get better, people can feel different. In one of my studies that a lot of the people had really difficult things happen to them, but they overcame them and in fact used that as their reason for making a change. And then last, I want to talk about, which is probably the most controversial one, which is this notion of, can money buy happiness? Does money make us any happier? And the answer is yes, but only to a point. That it becomes a point of what we call diminishing return, meaning that more money doesn't make you more happy or happier. And that, so the set point kind of depends on where you live, but it's something we refer to as basic needs plus. And what that means is that for the most part, all of your basic needs are covered. You have food, you have clothing, you have shelter, you can go to the doctor if you need to, and then you have some extra. So if you wanted to see a movie, or you wanted to grab a Starbucks, or you wanted to go on a little vacation, you could. So really, anything beyond that doesn't actually significantly change your level of happiness. So even in a study of billionaires, let us say, come back and say, but we don't believe that. Even in a study of billionaires, so people who had more money than they could ever possibly spend ever, still wanted to make more. Why is that? Because actually sometimes the act of earning triggers that reward center in our brain. But beyond that initial reward of earning more money, we actually are not any happier long-term with more money. Again, a point of contention. You're happy to comment on that in the chat or ask me about it later. The reason I kind of start with the things that don't impact happiness is because I think a lot of people, like I said, have this myth about the things that should make us happy. You know, again, in our 20s, we thought, when I have that car and that relationship and that house and that great job, I'm going to be happy. When in fact, the opposite is true. And so that's something we call happily ever after syndrome, which is all those things that you think would make you happy actually take a lot of work and may somehow be influencing your happiness in a less than positive way. So just coming back and thinking about, again, are the things that I think should make me happy actually making me happy? And it's worth revisiting. So I want to move on then to the things that actually do impact our happiness. First and foremost, across the board, is relationships. Doesn't matter what study, what country, when it was done, or kind of what generation, relationships are the #1 key factor to happiness. Next one, purpose and meaning, something called ikigai, if you've ever heard this terminology, which is basically, what's the reason I get out of bed? Now, one of the dilemmas is here in America, sometimes that means my job. But it doesn't have to be a job. It could be tending to a garden or raising grandchildren. Any number of things can provide you purpose and meaning, which then tends to make you feel happier. Gratitude. This is a really important one, and one we're going to talk about a little bit more here in a minute. Gratitude actually is it changes your brain. Gratitude requires you to use the more evolved part of your brain to be grateful, which means you can't really be stuck in emotion. So it's a great thing to do to quickly change into happiness. Service and altruism, again, we're going to talk about a little bit more, but doing kind things for other people makes you feel better. Fun. When was the last time you did something fun? Fun can bring us happiness. Now again, that might tie in more to that short-term happiness or that emotion of joy, but overall, people who have more fun tend to live happier lives. There was a study that came out not long ago that said nature, actually, between 2 and 6 hours outside will increase your happiness pretty significantly. All right, worth a try, right? Do nothing time. And again, I think this feels weird in a pandemic because it feels like we've been doing a lot of nothing. But are you using that time as nothing, or are you using it to worry? Are you using it to stress about what you're going to do? So we'll talk a little more about how we can use our do nothing time maybe in different ways. Um, One piece about, again, that happiness is creativity and flow. And so what that really means is thinking about when was the last time you got really into something? And maybe it was something at your work, maybe it was doing a puzzle where really nothing else mattered for that few moments. That's really important to our brain and really fuels our happiness. And then finally, one of the things that impacts our happiness is spirituality and personal belief systems. And not religion. Religion is a little bit complicated, but this overarching notion that maybe there's some help or some meaning behind this or some reason for why we're going through what we're going through really seems to make people feel happier. So to take this even further, I actually did my own survey. So I did a study with about 145 people, and again, ages range kind of the whole spectrum. And for the most part, I really just, it was open-ended to say, are you happy? Are you happy or are you not? And if you are, why? And if not, why? Interestingly, I had about 30 people who didn't fall into either category. They didn't really know if they were happy or not. And this felt a little confusing, except when they said, well, I'm normally a happy person, but right now, and whatever was happening. And so I think it gets back into that notion of happiness is not a constant state, but it does sometimes propel you to make changes. So let's find out what people from my survey said that I think it's interesting to kind of think about. So first of all, this notion of don't worry, be happy. Remember I said that those naturally happy people tended to have low levels of neuroses, meaning they didn't worry. I found that kind of across the board, that old song, don't worry, be happy, is actually correct. That happy people tended to not worry too much. You know, people often ask me, is depression the opposite of happiness? And I said, no, not really, but I think anxiety maybe. So really thinking about how worrying and anxiety might get in our way of happiness. Next, same thing, relationships. Across the board, relationships. Again, spirituality, feeling like there was a bigger purpose or a bigger meaning. This one was interesting when I say boundaries. So I'm going to say this, and feel free to repeat it if you like. Happy people say no. And what that meant is that happy people really seem to be able to prioritize doing the things that did bring them joy, that did make them happy, and saying no to things that didn't. Now, these are by no means were selfish people or jerks. They just had a better sense of, I'm going to spend my time on the things that matter to me, not on the things that don't. Similarly, happy people allowed themselves to experience emotions, meaning that if they were angry, they got angry, and then they moved on. If they were afraid, and then they moved on. And so I think it goes back to that notion I was talking about before when I talked about happiness as an emotion, is that when we don't have need for an emotion, it goes away. And happiness is that place of, I'm doing okay right now, which means I can't hold on to emotions that aren't actually helping me. Resilience. Happy people overcame things. Remember I said that trauma was not necessarily something that would prevent happiness. In fact, in my study, almost all of the happy people had something really, really awful happen to them. For some people, that was their catalyst to make a change, to say, I don't want to live this life, I want to be happier. And were able to overcome it. And finally, although there was this small subsection of naturally happy people, almost everybody else made a decision to work at it. Meaning that when they felt a point in their lives they weren't happy, they would do something to make themselves happy. Or they would do some analysis to say, why am I not happy? They did intentional things to build their relationships, like girls' night or family reunions, or things to intentionally have fun. So really, again, that happiness is not necessarily a natural state. We may have to work at it a little bit. Here are the findings from the unhappy people. So, as I said before, that worry just tends to get in the way. And unhappy people really wanted to know what was going to happen. In the middle of a pandemic, that's problematic because none of us know what's going to happen. We're all kind of waiting. Unhappy people had relationships, but they spoke about them differently. So happy people would say things like, I can call my friend when I need to talk. Whereas unhappy people would say, you know, I might have taken that job in New York, except my wife wouldn't want to go. And really thinking about the wife as a burden, not as a benefit. And so it wasn't, again, they didn't have meaningful relationships. They just viewed them as work, not necessarily as something that helped them. In a similar vein, they often focused on the expectations of others rather than what would make them happy. There's kind of this thought of, well, again, happiness is a selfish or personal pursuit. And I'm going to say, yeah, it kind of is, but you can't really work on other people's happiness. You can only really work on your own. What I found, though, when I was able to go back and interview maybe like the spouses of people, was that sometimes those expectations weren't even true. So again, the husband would say, well, I would be happy if we could move to California so I could take that dream job. And the wife said, I would have gone. So that's one of the dilemmas, is they don't even really check in to find out if other people's expectations are even accurate. Again, feeling stuck, unable to make a change, which I think was a really common one. So overall, you know, there was no difference demographically in the happy and unhappy people. That there were, age didn't matter, job didn't matter, socioeconomic status didn't matter, gender didn't matter. So what was the difference? In going back and re-looking at all of my data, there was one thing that I found. And it's back to this hope. This notion that it's going to be okay. Happy people were able to say, it's going to be okay. At some point, things will look or feel different, and that's going to be great. Unhappy people had a harder time pulling up that hope. And so this is where, again, I'm talking to you today, is to say we're in a place where it doesn't feel okay. We have a lot going on in our world, and I don't know if it's going to be okay. So how do we sustain that hope? So we're going to call on Olaf here to be our guide. Oops, I think I'm muted. And to say, here are the things we are going to do is really to focus on what we can, not focus on what we can't. And there's a lot we can't control right now. Primarily, it's, as I said, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and it is not business as usual. As much as we would like to be able to go about our lives are not normal. And I think we do need to be able to acknowledge that we have social distancing to worry about. We have masks to wear. We have friends to worry about. We don't know what's going to work and what we need to focus on. And so in the middle of a pandemic, it is a little bit more challenging to find that hope. So what we're going to, I like to tell people, it's kind of like trying to swim in a bathtub, that working on finding happiness in a pandemic, it's not impossible, but it's definitely pretty challenging. So let's talk about some of the things that we can do, even with social distancing, even with lockdowns. What are the things we can and should be worried about or thinking about? I want to first talk about this notion of relationships, because relationships exist in kind of two different ways. I think first is thinking about personal relationships. And those are people that you're close to, people that you interact with all the time. Over the course of this past 6 or 7 months, we've probably had way more closeness with people than we really want. And I get that. So being able to say, how can we think about our close relationships differently? You know, I hear a lot from parents who are like, I love my kids, but I really didn't plan on spending every single day with them for the past 7 months. So in what ways are you setting some of those boundaries? Similarly, we then have people who are close relationships, friends and family, who we haven't been able to see. So thinking about how you can vary some of that. We then have this second level, which I think people didn't really think about until we were maybe a month or two into some of the lockdown, about how much they miss their community. And these may not be your best friends or people you even see every day, but people who, again, when you're standing on the playground to pick up your kids, you can have a conversation with. The barista, the same barista who gets your coffee every day. Even some of your coworkers. You know, how many of you are still working somewhat remotely and maybe haven't been able to see the people that you care about the most? So let's talk about some activities to deal with those relationships and really think about how do we address this. One is thinking about our close relationships. Using technology as best we can. And I know a lot of people are tired of Zoom, so what else can we do? Text messaging, maybe thinking about cards, pictures, letters, socially distanced happy hours where people set up their lawn chairs on the side of the street with their masks and their own private beers. What are you doing to be able to acknowledge people you're thinking about them and you care about them, even if you can't hug them or touch them right now? Also then thinking about your community strategies. How are you staying connected to the world of those people who, again, you're probably not going to send a text message to or do a Zoom visit with, but really just acknowledging the community. Some of the things that have happened over the pandemic are just basic, saying hello when you can, talking to people when it feels safe to do so, recognizing that we can still have conversations even with our 6 feet and with our masks. Again, thank yous, acknowledging what other people may be doing, even doing things like writing little messages on chalk in front of your sidewalk may work. And then we also have what are called loving kindness practices, which is really more you hanging out in your own mind, wishing well to other people around the world. And I know it seems like, well, how's that going to help me build relationships? But sometimes just thinking about the people you care about triggers that feeling of happiness for us. Another thing we can do is thinking about altruism. Remember, I said that's one thing. So one thing to think about from a happiness perspective is, how can I help? What really is the best way to help? What can I do? Now, unlike other crises or other times of disaster, we can't go out and just help. It's not safe. It's not safe to all go out and do a cleanup brigade. So what do we do? How can we be helpful? And I think this is something just to think about. You know, do I have any unique skills that I can offer that I can be helpful? If I'm going to work anyway, you know, could I stop by the store and pick up some milk and bread for my neighbor who may be less likely to want to go out? Can I, again, bring in donuts for all of you guys who are essential workers and doing what you need to do just to kind of say we appreciate everybody being here. And then it feels good to you and to them. Gratitude, as I mentioned before, is one of those things that actually shifts our brain. It is some way to say, how can I find some good in this? Now, I know this has been a really big challenge because in 2020, what good has there been? What good has come from this? Now, in some of my other workshops, people have been able to draw from that. They've really been able to say, you know what, this is not what I wanted, but I've gotten to spend more time with my family than I had in the past 6 months than I have probably in the last 5 years. That in fact, being forced to slow down has helped me a little bit, really reevaluate what it is I want to do with my life or how I spend my time. Even gratitude of, you know what, I'm healthy and that's great. And I'm glad I can still go to work and provide care to those who need it most. And for that, I'm grateful. So some ways you can do it is, again, in the moment, when you need a really quick happiness boost, is to say, right now, what do I feel most grateful for? Or again, working on a gratitude journal. The other way you can do this bigger is I took on a couple of years ago something called the Thank You Note Project, whereas once a week, I would send a thank you note to somebody. And it could have been something big, like to my parents, or it might have been something small, like to the server who brought me extra fries. it didn't have to be something outrageous, just something to acknowledge that I was grateful for, which made me feel better. And then I actually sent them a note, which then made them feel better. And so it was just kind of a fun way to kind of spread the happiness a little bit and spread the gratitude, while also recognizing that I had way more people to be thankful for than I thought. I thought I was just going to write 52 and do one a week. There were several weeks where I ended up sending out 3 or 4, just because I was able to recognize how much good there were and how many people did care about me and what was good about the world. So that may be something to think about, or again, a fun project for the family. So this is a famous Socrates quote, is that in fact, we think to be happy we have to do more, when in fact, maybe what we need to do is to do less. And what do I mean by that? So some do nothing strategies. Remember I said do nothing doesn't mean you are, it doesn't mean that you were worrying, you're actually using your time in some way. And so one of those might be meditation. Another might be spending out time outside, or another may simply just be daydreaming. There's actually huge value in kind of that creativity and flow in letting our minds just wander. So a lot of times I will ask people, I'll give them kind of a challenge to say, is there a way you can do nothing? Give yourself 10 or 15 minutes a day, you turn off your phone and just sit and just see what happens. You can think. It's not like meditation where you're controlling your thought, but you're not actively doing anything. You'd be surprised how many people find just that 15 minutes really, really refreshing. As I said before, that fun can also be the antidote to fear. When was the last time you did something fun? And again, I know in a pandemic, it's like, what is there fun to do in a pandemic? But this may be where, again, you have to get really creative and try and think like, well, what could I do that might be fun, that might be different, that might really take my mind off of worrying and what I can't control back to what I actually can. So some questions of what does this all mean? Where do we go from here? How do I work on my happiness plan? So this is something I would encourage you to really think about, to say, how can I use this time when I can't control a lot to focus on things that maybe I can control? Maybe it is finding something fun to do this week. Maybe it is writing a single thank you note. Maybe it is, reaching out to some old people that you've not connected with, rekindling some of those relationships. Or even at your workplace, taking a minute or two just to check in with somebody else, to say, hey, how are you doing? Let's share a joke. Let's laugh about something. Really finding ways to say, how can we carry this hope through when it feels like everything is hopeless? And so I'm hoping that some of these specific strategies will help. But I also want to acknowledge that this has not been easy. And so I do want to remind you that resources are available. One that's available to all of you is the Healthcare Worker Wellbeing Support Line, which may just be a place to dump some things, to say, you know what, I've been carrying this for too long. Here, I'm going to let you have it. And then to kind of walk away. To remember, we also have other resources on campus if you need them when it feels like happiness feels out of reach, that it's bigger than I'm worried about the pandemic or bigger than I can't find my happiness, then maybe I need some additional help. And so again, here's a place to start if you need that support. So before we move on, I do want to just say that you guys can do this, that happiness is a fun thing to be working on. It really is. Like the year I did my happiness project was a really interesting year for me when I was super intentional about focusing on my happiness. I learned a lot, but it was fun. It was fun. And so I'm hoping you guys can find some fun in that. So I do want to do a closing gratitude activity, and then I'm going to turn it over to questions. So you guys can either challenge me on anything I've said today or ask specific questions about your happiness plans. So to go ahead and wrap up, I'd like each of you to just take a look at the palm of your hand. And I want you to think of something for which you're grateful that's small. So just something small. And it could be that, you had hot water in your shower this morning. Next is the relationship finger. We typically think about our ring finger as relationships. So what's a relationship for which you're grateful? The next one is our largest finger, and we can think about this in a couple ways. One is we can think about it as what's something really big I'm grateful for. Or two, we can think about it in, it's kind of an impolite way to say that I'm not happy about something. What's something that you're not happy happened, but you grew from it and you grew stronger? So really building some of that resilience, reminding yourself that you've been through tough things. Next is our pointer finger. So to find something you can point to for which you're grateful. Last is our thumb. Give yourself a thumbs up. What's something you've done today, even if it's showing up at this seminar, that you've done for yourself, that you're proud of? And then finally, that leaves us with an empty palm. And in yoga, this is the mudra, which is kind of hand yoga, the mudra for willingness or openness. So what is something I'm hoping for, that I'm going to accept, that's going to be great and going to be good, and I'm ready and willing to accept it? And hopefully that will bring you some hope of all the good things that are yet to come. So I want to go ahead and let you know, if you don't get all your questions answered today, feel free to reach out to me. I'm over at the Depression Center. There's our website. And then you can also email me if there are questions that come up, or you need information about resources or anything like that. So I'm just going to quickly stop share here so that I can answer questions in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask me whatever it is you'd like to know about happiness.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lopez. This was a really helpful presentation. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if anyone would like to ask a question, you can either unmute yourselves or place it in the chat, and I'll read it to Dr. Lopez.
And again, feel free to ask specifics about some of the things we covered. Like I said, specifics about things that do make you happy or don't make you happy. Or again, finding happiness in a pandemic.
I'll start off with a question. So I know personally I've found a lot of time to read during the pandemic and quarantine. Could you maybe recommend a couple of books on the topic, or something that you think has been helpful to others to read during a year like this?
Absolutely. So, you know, there are a ton of happiness books out there. There are probably, you could easily find 400 titles, but 400 books with happiness in the title or about happiness. And so one that's really easy and straightforward is Gretchen Rubin's The Happiness Project. If you really are looking for something concrete to do, that would be something I would recommend. I also really like the book What Happy People Know, which is by Dan Baker. And this one's kind of funny. He is a therapist at Canyon Ranch, which is kind of a spa wellness center for really, really wealthy people. And so he talks a lot about, again, some of these myths of happiness coming from fame or fortune or money, and some of the challenges. So I just found those to be really interesting books. If you're more on the spiritual side and want something to kind of navigate through the pandemic, there's a really great book called When the Heart Waits by Sue Monk Kidd. It is, again, more spiritual in nature, but it really helps with this notion of hope and tolerance and waiting through things that are really difficult to get through. So those are some recommendations I have. But there are lots of other really fun ones out there.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? I do have one other one. How has the pandemic, in terms of telehealth and moving a lot of these therapy appointments, social work appointments to Zoom and other programs, how has that been going? Has it been going well, or I'm sure there's probably some things that were unanticipated with everything going on?
Absolutely. So I think that's a really great question because I think it applies not only to kind of the therapeutic relationship, but just how all of us are kind of approaching this new world. So for our clinic, we had actually done a fair amount of telehealth early, so we made a transition pretty easily. And I think most of our therapists were ready and prepared to go. And we actually, that very first week, were able to transfer about 90% of our appointments online because we already had the structure in place and because we already had therapists and providers who were comfortable doing telehealth. So for us, it was pretty easy, but I think there have been some unanticipated challenges and some interesting things, like the number of times we've had to ask patients to put a shirt on or other clothing, or please don't take the camera to the bathroom with you. That can wait. So I think those have been challenges. Challenges from our side of how much do we disclose? You know, that when I have my daughter walking by in the back of a telehealth appointment, well, I guess you guys all know something about me now that was different. And so I think that it's been good that we've been able to still support people during this time. And a lot of the patients have, again, appreciated it, that they like being able to continue with their care. Some patients have not liked it as well, as I'm sure you guys have found. But thinking about kind of pros or cons, is it better to not have anything, to have the telehealth, or to have kind of a shortened masked visit? So I think those are a lot of questions about what that means moving forward. I will say it's been interesting and challenging to think about what we can do differently, both in person when those resume, just based on what we've learned from telehealth, and what ways we can really expand telehealth to be beneficial. So that's a great question.
Great, thank you.
One thing we didn't talk about that I do want to throw out there, just because I didn't include it anywhere, was I do a lot of presentations, and during the pandemic, the request I've gotten to talk about most frequently, anyone want to guess? It's actually been parenting. And so for any of you guys who are parents, I first want to say the literature around happiness and parenting in general is mixed. That parenting is the one thing that makes you happy and unhappy at the exact same time. And I think that's never been more true than during the pandemic. That on one hand, parents have been able to say, like, this has been amazing. I get to spend time with my kids, and I get to, I really get to play games with them and go on bike rides with them. And I've had lunch with my daughter every day for the past 7 months. But I've also had lunch with my daughter every day for the past 7 months. And it's hard. It's hard trying to navigate the homeschooling. It's hard to take something that was difficult anyway and just get it compounded by now having to navigate work from home and trying to manage a homeschool and trying to deal with kids who also can't go out and see their friends. So I would say, for any of you who maybe we didn't touch on that's been a really common concern, is how in the heck am I supposed to parent and work and do homeschool and navigate a pandemic? And so lots of people have been asking that. We've been doing lots of, actually, like I said, talks about that because it has been so stressful for people. But it's also been fun too. All right. Any other questions or any other comments you guys may have?
I have a question about kind of finding happiness where you are. I'm so future focused, like when this happens and when that happens, things will be, not that everything will be perfect, but things will be better, or things will be easier or whatever. So how do you work with people when they're always projecting that something's gonna be better when this or that happens?
That's a great question. And I think one of the things we've had to do is really to say we don't know, especially with the pandemic. We don't know if it's going to be better or it's going to be worse. We don't know. We don't know if this election is going to be better or worse. And so one of the things you can do is really to come back and say, well, we don't know, right? I don't want to steal anybody's hope, but there's still a lot of uncertainty, which creates a whole nother level of how do we deal with uncertainty. Which is the second piece, is bringing it back to the now, of right now, how am I doing? right now, today, what am I doing? And that's been a lot of what we've worked with people around, is to say, because the future is so unpredictable, is to start making short-term plans, not long-term plans. You know, to say, what are we going to do today? What are we going to do this week? But let's not plan for Christmas, because we don't know what Christmas is going to look like. We might be able to travel, we might not. We really don't know. And so to say that. On the other hand, there is a piece of hope that I think it's fun to just kind of play with. You know, kind of like when you ask kids, what are they going to be when they grow up? Is to kind of throw out to your friends and coworkers again, like, what are you going to do when this is all over? And really thinking of it more from kind of a fantasy standpoint, or a hope or a dreaming standpoint, of like, I can't wait to hug my friends, or I can't wait, oddly, to go back to Elitch's. What are the things you really can't wait for, or that you really are hoping to do once this is all over? So I think there's a place for both. There's a place for hope and a place for staying grounded in, this is our reality now, and we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's coming.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions or any other happiness things you guys would like to talk about maintaining hope? Like I said, it's a weird time to talk about happiness. But I also think we should and we have to, so that we don't lose our hope.
Well, if no
All
one
right.
has any other questions, we can end the presentation for today. Dr. Lopez, again, thank you so much for presenting this. This was very timely and helpful for us right now. And just a reminder to everyone on the call, we will be sending out an anonymous survey after this. So please fill that out so we can get feedback on the Lunch and Learn, the presentation, and also suggestions for future speakers as well. So again, thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. And feel free to reach out to me if you have some lingering questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.